My name is Leah Watts. I'm with Folk Alliance International, and I just want to welcome you and thank you for joining us for today's webinar, Introduction to Cultural Diversity, as part of our Folk Ed series. Folk Ed is a program that is a part of FAI's ongoing advocacy and outreach efforts, with a goal to provide professional and career development opportunities. As you should all be able to see, you should have a control panel if you are joining us from a computer today. And there's a box called questions where throughout the presentation today, you can ask questions that you may have. We'll address some of these questions throughout the presentation, and we will cover the rest at the end with a Q&A section. You can also hide the control panel with that little small orange arrow. That'll allow you to see the presentation that is being presented to you today. And that PowerPoint presentation is also available as a handout download if you would like. We'll also be posting a recording of this webinar and the handout on folk.org later this week. So if you're wanting to make a reference to something, you will have access to that. So let's get started. As one part of our reconciliation process, Folk Alliance International starts all public meetings, concerts, and industry events with a land acknowledgement. This is done to show respect for Indigenous peoples, to recognize their unique culture and enduring relationship to the land, and to raise awareness about histories that are often suppressed or forgotten. We here at Folk Alliance acknowledge that our office is located on the traditional territory of the Osage and Kaw nations. We extend our gratitude to the original inhabitants of this land and their present community members. Today's webinar is an introduction to cultural equity and is part of a series of training sessions that we, Folk Alliance International, have committed to as an organization. In 2016, our board of directors released a values statement regarding diversity and inclusion, which has informed our community outreach and annual programming. We've also undertaken continued staff and board training since then, and this year we'll be holding a global summit hosted by the Association for Cultural Equity, which will in turn lead to the development of a cultural equity plan for Folk Alliance International. With that as a little bit of background context, I would like to introduce you to Evelyn Boswell of Renaissance Management and Training Solutions and our facilitator for today's webinar. Renaissance is a Kansas City-based organization that provides cultural sensitivity training and seeks to improve intercultural gender and racial relations. So Evelyn, I will pass it on to you.
Thank you, Leah. I certainly appreciate the opportunity to be here. I certainly appreciate Folk Alliance International and the staff for supporting me. Just a great big shout out to all of those who are listening in on today's presentation, Introduction to Cultural Equity. Thank you for taking the time out of your busy day to join us to talk about an important subject as this. A little bit about me. Before joining Renaissance Management and Training Solutions, I worked in various industries as an HR manager and consultant, lending expertise in diversity and inclusion, performance management, conflict resolution, employee engagement, and recruiting for notable organizations such as Ronald McDonald House Charities, the Federal Reserve Bank of Kansas City, Government Employees Health Association, Hallmark Cards Incorporated, and Allied Signal Aerospace Corporation. I'll share more about myself later, but for now, let me share a little bit about what our course outline will consist of. We'll go through bias, and we'll have examples of certain definitions that we want you all to be familiar with. Maybe some of you are, but maybe some of these definitions will be new to some. We'll talk about culture and introduce a self-awareness exercise. We'll look at diversity and specifically at marginalization. We'll review some common gender terms and share strategies for cultural equity. Now, throughout the presentation, you're going to get a hint that I include examples and strategies all the while I'm talking. So we're not just going to wait till the end to provide these strategies for you. I'll even give you a hint and say, hey, here's a strategy, okay? So by the end of this webinar, I hope to accomplish these objectives: provide a baseline understanding of cultural equity, provide general terminology for cultural proficiency, recognize and reflect upon one's own cultural biases, consider that some of the norms and practices one treats as universal might actually be culturally dependent, and we'll hope to seek points of connection and interact with those who are different from ourselves. So since this webinar is about culture, let me share a little bit more about my culture. Some obvious and not so obvious characteristics are, I'm an African American female, and I'm going to admit over the air that I'm over 50. I'm a wife, mother, grandmother, daughter, sister, aunt, and BFF. I was born and raised in Arkansas, and I'm certain you could not tell that by my twang. So I'm a Southerner. I'm Christian by faith. I live in the suburbs of Kansas City. I am a sports fan. I love football, basketball, baseball, and I'll just say right now, go Chiefs. And I love all types of music, okay? So since I was raised and lived near Memphis, Tennessee, of course, there were always the blues with B.B. King playing. There's R&B, there was country, certainly there was Elvis. There was pop, rock, and classical. And now with the 16-year-old who plays the trombone, we're always listening to jazz. And I have to tell you that I do own a Kep Mo DVD. So that's a little bit about my culture. I'm gonna ask you, if you were to choose between hamburger and sushi for lunch, which would you prefer? If you had to choose between cola and beer to drink, which would you prefer? If you had to wake up early in the morning, or if you could choose to be a night owl, which would you prefer? If you had to vacation on the beach or in the mountains, which would you prefer? If you had to create new music or cover the oldies, which would you prefer? Singing or dancing, which would you prefer? So let's talk about those preferences that you chose. By choosing one selection over the other, you are declaring what your preference is. How do our preferences develop? Well, there was a study by Martin in 2014 that explained that humans seem to lack the cognitive capacity to store all the information necessary about a single person, and that our brains synthesize this information overload by discarding the details and filtering stimuli into broad categories. While this may be interesting, the glaring problem with the phenomenon is that traits go from attributes to categories, losing information about the individual in the process. More simply, stereotypes form because of the brain's remarkable efficiency, but the effects of this saved brain power have an incredibly detrimental impact in the real world. So where does it become a problem when you have your own preferences? And is there a problem when pressuring my preferences onto others? Well, another unsettling finding by Martin in his research was that the formation of these stereotypes was simplified, at times spontaneous, and passed along from person to person. Do you remember a game, maybe when you were growing up and you told someone a truth and you whispered it to them, but by the time it rotated throughout the classroom and the last person heard the message, it was entirely different? Well, that's the same way when we synthesize information that's given to us and it's passed along from one person to another person, even generationally, and things become filtered in such a way that the last outcome does not resemble the first input. We often endorse things we hear from family members and the media and culture at large, things that may not have any sort of factual grounding. Problems arise when we use preferences for facts, for buying homes in certain zip codes, traveling to certain countries or not traveling at all, or even selecting dating partners. When do preferences become a problem? When it prevents us from being impartial in our judgments. Bottom line, preferences are our brain's shortcut influenced by culture, and they're not always accurate. So let's look at a word that's close to preference. That word is bias. We have a natural preference for those like us and prejudiced against those not like us. That is rooted in our physiology, according to Martin. So the definition for bias is it's a prejudice in favor of or against one thing, person, or group compared with another, usually in a way considered to be unfair. You may have heard the term affinity bias. It's our natural tendency to like people similar to us. They're usually called the in group, and dislike those dissimilar to us. They're considered then the out group. I'll give you an example of affinity bias. Joining a college sorority or fraternity with like-minded people could be one. The term implicit bias, an automatic unconscious attitude or stereotype based on past experiences and associations that affect our behavior and decisions about others. Implicit bias occurs when individuals make judgments about people based on gender, race, or other factors without even realizing they're doing it. It's unconscious. An example of that, of a stereotype, is yelling at an elderly person because you believe that older people can't hear. Okay? It's kind of funny when you think about it, especially if an older person has to tell you, wait, I've lost my hearing, or no, I've not lost my hearing, right? I'm just older. Explicit bias. Attitudes and beliefs we have about a person or group on a conscious level. It's a belief that your race, religion, gender, political party, or etc. is superior to others, and you do things to marginalize those you deem lesser. You may create laws, policies, rules to make sure that that lesser group is contained. An example of that could be racial profiling, or even worse, genocide. I don't know if there's a worse, but it's bad altogether, racial profiling and genocide. So we all have bias. You do, I do. The question isn't, do we have bias, but which biases do we have? If a bias prevents us from being fair to others in our society, then we look for ways to overcome those negative biases. So be intentional about putting biases aside when we're meeting people. Our bottom line, my biases are my brain's shortcuts influenced by culture and life experiences that consciously or unconsciously guide my behavior. So let's take a look at an exercise. This exercise is regarding implicit bias, that unconscious biasness that we may not realize that we have. This exercise is called the circle of trust. We're only going to take about 60 seconds to complete this exercise. So if you have a piece of paper beside you, write down the first names of up to 5 people whom you trust the most. We're only going to take 30 seconds to do this, and these 5 people that you trust the most are not family members. We'll start. Okay, so to avoid overthinking, that's why we're going so fast. Another 30 seconds, you'll see the dimensions on that chart, just 1 through 10 on your piece of paper. Quickly place a tally beside the names of your trusted circle who are the same as you in each of the following diversity dimensions. And those dimensions are at the bottom there. Race, 1 through 5 that you listed as most trusted. Are they of the same race as you? Are they of the same color as you? Are they the same age as you? What about gender? National origin? Religion? Ability or disability? Education? Political affiliation? Or social economic status? What does this cultural exercise say about us? It says that we have a natural preference for those like us. We naturally trust those like us. If most of the diversity dimensions 1 through 10 were checked for each person you listed, then we have a natural preference for those who are like us. We trust people naturally like ourselves. So look at your list. Check to see if there was anyone who did not meet any diversity dimensions. If no diversity dimension was checked for someone, your circle of trust is truly broad and diverse. And so we'd want to know, why do you trust them? What is it about them that you trust that came to light when you first thought of your most trusted people in your life? So what's one suggestion for reducing implicit bias? Here's a strategy: broadening your circle of trust. Build relationships by learning the culture of those unlike ourselves. I have a scenario for you. It's an implicit bias scenario. You and your friends decide to go to dinner together. After you receive your food, your friend Rachel asks for chopsticks. When the waiter returns with the chopsticks, Rachel hands them to you and says, "I figure you would be more comfortable eating with these." So, can you think of why Rachel may just hand over chopsticks to me to eat? Was it because of how I looked? Did she assume certain things about me? How do you confront Rachel and share with her that you've never eaten with chopsticks? You know, quite an assumption on Rachel's part. I can tell you that I've had a similar situation happen to me, and maybe you've had something similarly happen to you in your life. For me, I was on a committee with some people. One was my friend, and she would always be assigned to recruit at Hispanic serving institutions. Her last name, because she married into the family, was a Hispanic culturally sounding name. Yet the leader of our committee would not assign her to any other task but to meet students from Hispanic serving institutions. The issue: my friend does not know how to speak Spanish. She's actually French Vietnamese, and she had trouble sharing with the leader of the committee, how do I not just get Hispanic service institutions assigned to me, but I'd like to also meet other students from other cultures. Have you ever been placed in a situation where you were wrongly assessed by your looks? It takes courage to speak up and share in a difficult conversation similar to the one we've listed here for implicit bias. For me, in my personal situation, I did go to the leader, and I took it upon myself because it was uncomfortable to see my friend squirm whenever she was assigned something that was not in her repertoire, something that she wasn't as comfortable with. The bad thing about that is sometimes we get defensive when people bring things to our attention when we've made mistakes. We'll talk about this a little bit more in the webinar, that when we've made a mistake, be accountable, apologize, learn more, correct yourself, and move on. So let's look at those cultural definitions that we should be familiar with going forward. Culture signifies the way of life of a group of connected people that is inclusive of their ideas, values, beliefs, norms, language, traditions, and artifacts. Cultural awareness and proficiency is compassionate study, sensitivity, and curiosity with people groups outside your culture for a deeper understanding and connection with them. Seeking to add to the knowledge base by conducting research, improving relations between cultures, and promoting self-determination. Cultural blindness: the incapacity to comprehend how specific situations may be seen by individuals belonging to another culture due to a strict alignment with the viewpoints, outlooks, and morals of one's own culture. It's like painting all cultures with a broad universal brush, and your culture's broad brush. That's the one that matters. Cultural competence is the acceptance and respect for difference, continuing self-assessment and expansion of knowledge and resources to better meet the needs of diverse populations. So having a favorable cultural attitude is connecting or disconnecting with people outside your culture based on different degrees of fairness, value, and respect, what we call favor held for them. You can have high favor for a group because you've studied, done research, followed their culture. You may have even married into the culture, but you have high favor or value and respect, and you look for ways to learn more. Cultural attitude. So, cultural equity. We started this webinar by saying it's an introduction to cultural equity. Equity means that all have equal chance to be successful. Cultural equity embodies the values, policies, and practices that ensure that all people, including but not limited to those who have been historically underrepresented based on race, ethnicity, age, disability, sexual orientation, gender identity, socioeconomic status, geography, citizenship status, or religion, are represented in the development of arts policy, the support of artists, the nurturing of accessible, thriving venues for expression, and the fair distribution of programmatic, financial, and informational resources. Cultural Equity Survey that you see before you is an introspective inventory. This is when we take the pause to look at ourselves to say, what is it about me that maybe needs some work? Maybe I could do more in a particular area of cultural equity. So this is not a test. It's not a psychological assessment. It truly is just a self-inventory tool. There are 1 to 10 statements. The first slide that you see show 1 through 5. There's no right or wrong answer, truly just true or false. And see how you measure. Number 1, knowledge of other cultures helps us improve our understanding of others. Do you think that's a true or false statement? Number 2, a favorable attitude towards other cultures contributes to a peaceful life. True or false? Number 3, people should try to get to know people of different cultures. Number 4, knowing your biases gives you choices to change those that are not helpful. Number 5, people should intervene when they observe others engaged in insensitivity, bias, and discrimination towards others. Number 6, men and women should be treated equals in most every way. Number 7, people should not discriminate against others because of their age. Number 8, even though someone's moral or religious viewpoint may differ, they should treat those with different sexual orientations respectfully. Number 9, generally, we should treat others who are different as we want to be treated. And the last one, we should educate ourselves on topics such as diversity, inclusion, and equity. So if there were any false responses, perhaps there's an opportunity to close a cultural gap, to open yourself to cultural awareness. That's what this survey does. It provides more suggestions to reduce implicit bias and broaden our cultural awareness. Hint, another strategy. So I was looking at Folk Alliance International, and I saw that there's a LinkedIn site for FAI. And I thought, yes, I'll follow FAI and see what cultural posts or events may be placed out there. Here's another way to connect with people from all over the world, to connect and to learn about others through a source that's free. I like it that you can go out there and meet people. So if there was a question about in certain cultures about folk music around the world, here's a great way, since FAI already has a site out there, to post and ask questions about it. And I think I'm going to do that every now and then, just see what the new posts are concerning your organization. And did I say it's free? Yeah, I like that part too. So based on my culture that I shared with you, these are my expectations, and I wonder, are they universal? I shake hands when I meet someone, make direct eye contact with the person I'm speaking with. If someone sneezes, I say, bless you. I don't talk with food in my mouth. Don't eat off another person's plate without asking. And believe that men should be strong and not show emotion. So, what I've researched and found out by broadening my cultural awareness is that handshaking is common, but not universal. In some cultures, especially around the Mediterranean and the Caribbean, a hug or an air kiss are favored over a handshake. Instead of bless you when someone sneezes, saying health is a preferred response in many countries. So from all over the world, what I may see as appropriate behavior may be totally inappropriate elsewhere and not accepted. What I learned as inappropriate may be acceptable else places. Culture changes. Have you found that out? In today's time, men are showing emotion. As a mother, it is acceptable to have my children eat off my plate. Things change depending on culture and timing. It would be cultural blindness on my part to now continue in my beliefs and expect the rest of the world to adopt my cultural norms. Maybe you found that to be the case, whether you've traveled outside of your culture and you've had to learn about others you're visiting, that certain things are not universal or universally accepted as we may think. Now to introduce or review some diversity definitions. What is diversity? It's the understanding that each individual is unique and recognizing our individual differences. These can be along the dimensions of race, ethnicity, gender, sexual orientation, socioeconomic status, age, physical abilities, religious beliefs, political beliefs, or other ideologies. Diversity is about representation. Equity, the next word, is the practice that ensures all people receive fair and just treatment. Ethnocentrism, you may have heard, is the tendency for people to believe their culture is morally best or superior and use it as the viewpoint or standard to evaluate all other cultures. Ethnicity refers to cultural factors, including nationality, regional culture, ancestry, and language. An example of ethnicity I'll share with you, because sometimes I even get it confused with race. Ethnicity is German or Spanish ancestry, for example. Your ethnicity is determined based on the social and cultural groups you belong to. And you can have more than one ethnicity. Inclusion, an environment in which all individuals are treated fairly and respectfully, have equal access to opportunities and resources, and can contribute fully. Inclusion is about involvement. Multicultural, relating to or constituting several cultural ethnic groups within a society. Multiracial is having mixed ancestry of two or more races. And then race. It refers to a person's physical characteristics such as bone structure and skin, hair or eye color. One example of race is brown, white, or black. Your race is determined by how you look. You are said to have one race even if it's mixed race. It is the mixed race. So as you talk about diversity, there are some conversations then that lead to the marginalization of people. Marginalization is the process of making people invisible or less important, relegating them to a secondary position. In the graphic, I've shown you that the social, economic, cultural, and political systems slightly overlap with the diversities of people in the center. Those are just a few of the listing of diverse reasons people can be marginalized. There could be a very longer list attached to this. Social exclusion or disenfranchisement, you may have heard, is the utmost form of marginalization. It refers to entire communities of people who are systematically blocked from these social systems, from access to rights, resources, and opportunities normally available to members of a different group. So if you were part of the marginalized people that's located in the center, and yes, you can be a single parent, unemployed, and homeless, right? So those factors listed in the middle of the page, in the middle of that graphic there, and have only some resources that are social and available to you. You may have only limited amount of access to health care, education, clean drinking water, housing, even voting. We see the stories in the news from all over the world. What can be done to reduce or eliminate marginalization of people in our societies? I'm going to offer that we be a strong ally. Educate ourselves on the privileges our own culture group enjoys to better understand the perspectives of members of marginalized communities. So here are 5 additional things I think we can do. 1, start paying attention to what you say. Most people already know to avoid generalizations and stereotypes. We talked about preferences and biases earlier. But most of us are still guilty of using language that can cause offense, even if we don't mean to. Number 2, be willing to accept correction. Even the most well-meaning people make mistakes and have misunderstandings about others. When someone points out your errors, offer a sincere apology and be ready to learn from the experience. It will earn you much more respect than responding with defensiveness or anger. Number 3, be intolerant of intolerance. Are you willing to confront derogatory and hateful speech online or in person? What if the person is a friend or relative? The risk of staying silent is sending the message that discrimination and intolerance are values that you are willing to put up with. Number 4, seek out marginalized voices and perspectives. If you have the opportunity to spend time with someone from a marginalized group, your most important job is to listen. Listen to them and learn from them. And my last strategy to reduce implicit bias or marginalization of people is to educate your own community. Your voice is most effective within your own group since you are in the best position to confront its stereotypes and misunderstandings, some of which you may have overcome yourself. You also have a special access to them as an audience that other communities do not, so use it. So as you can see from this slide, there are a lot of gender definitions, and I can share with you from the time since I was a small girl till now, lots of terms have been introduced that I was unfamiliar with. So part of my cultural competency is to make sure that I am familiar with terms so that, as I suggested in the marginalized slide, not to be offensive to anyone. I'm only going to review some of the definitions today on this webinar. You'll see at the bottom of the page a link where you can go and visit all of the definitions that were provided. by the LGBTQ community. To start, gender. It refers to the role of a male or female in society. These roles are influenced by perceptions and expectations arising from cultural, political, economic, religious factors, as well as customs, ethnicity, and class. Gender identity is the intuitive sense of who you are. It can incorporate how you want other people to see you, how you relate to others, and how you see yourself. So I skip down to sexual orientation is the pattern your sexual attraction takes based on gender, the people you tend to find sexually attractive. Queer, it's an umbrella term for the LGBTQ plus community. It's a sexual orientation that is intentionally left vague. Many people identify as queer because they feel that no other sexuality term applies to them. People who identify as queer may also do so to specifically and publicly reject society's prevailing view of sexuality. And I want you to put a note here. Some people experience queer as a slur, so please use the term with care. Transgender. People who have a gender identity or expression different from the one they were assigned at birth or are expected to exhibit. If you look at non-binary, people whose gender identity does not fit the strict man-woman dichotomy. And sex. It refers to the biological differences between males and females, such as the genitalia and genetic differences. So, what I've learned in research and making sure that I'm more culturally aware is I can show my inclusivity of others when they're expressing gender identity. And maybe you've seen the personal gender pronouns attached to people's email taglines. Those pronouns of she, her, hers. It may give a person's name, and then it's he, him, his, or they, them, theirs. Words that an individual would like others to use when talking to or about them, rather than we mistaking or assuming something based on our own cultural paradigm. This may be helpful if you see my communications, especially in an email, with the pronoun that I would prefer for my own gender identity. Therefore, it leaves out assumptions. It leaves out my own cultural biases. So, why are gender pronouns important? So, think about it. If referred to by the wrong pronoun, it can make one feel disrespected, invalidated, and even alienated. It's also, when you're showing inclusivity of this sort, it's a positive way to support others that you may have on a work team or those in your community and your family to show that you're in support of their gender identity, which may be a change from which you've once known them. So, what are some ways to promote cultural equity? Well, we've shared some throughout. The Cultural Equity Survey was one way to promote equity, if there were any false statements listed there. The inclusivity of gender pronouns is another way. Here are some additional ways. Valuable cultural experiences, the benefits and costs of scale, and arts and social change. So valuable cultural experiences. I grouped listening to folk music under this particular umbrella. I think that's stepping outside of some comfort zones for me, especially growing up with a limited amount, but I'd like to listen to more. Attending concerts, opera, ballet, art exhibits, reading literature, eating cultural food and wine that's different from what you would normally eat. Outreach is another type of cultural experiences. Finding opportunities to talk with people from different cultures can lend to more understanding about their culture. Attending different faith communities, going shopping at a store from another culture. I'd love that. Participating in cultural heritage celebrations, something else that we do annually. Invite a person over from another culture to lunch or even to your house for dinner. As I mentioned earlier, linking in with someone and finding out a new buddy that way and finding out from one-on-one connections their particular culture and what's important to them. Leveraging the benefits and costs of scale. Consider the effects folk music programming has on our culture and on its ability to create specific benefits for artists, audiences, and communities. One suggestion you may be undertaking is mentoring interns or mentoring young people in the community. Providing opportunities to share your poetry, your lyrics, your songs, your novels, your music at community fairs or on public television. Volunteering at a nonprofit organization. It may not cost a lot to do that. I can share you one incident that I experienced at Ronald McDonald House Charities. We looked up one Saturday and Yo-Yo Ma was there wanting to know if he could perform with his cello for all of the children and families who were sick and residing there at the home. What was the cost of that to Ronald McDonald House? That was priceless, let me tell you. And just think of who you're impacting going forward. What's the arts and social changes and benefits for cultural equity? There's been lots of discussion about whether the arts activities are designed to combat bias or other forms of oppression. Art is often a vehicle for social change. It can give voice to the political or socially disenfranchised. A song, film, or novel can rouse emotions in those who encounter it, inspiring them to rally for change. So in summary, combat cultural incompetence or cultural blindness where you see it. As we mentioned before, ways to do so could be by sharing the circle of trust. Become culturally proficient by stepping outside your own culture to learn of others. It can be as simple as walking across the room at a conference and introducing yourself. You never know who you may learn that you're sitting next to, and they have a wealth of knowledge to share. Also, using the personal gender pronouns or educating yourself and others in your community about the new things that you just learned about a different culture. Read books. Just saw one that was just released, Talking to Strangers by Malcolm Gladwell. That's now on my reading list. I hope to get real soon. But this concludes the webinar information that I wanted to present today. We're certainly open to any questions. I'd certainly want to see what you had to say and what some of your comments were. Leah, do we have any questions?
Yeah, we do. First, I just want to say thank you so much for being here today and sharing your knowledge with us. We really, really appreciate it. I know I learned a lot, and I think we have some other staff members in here listening, and I think they've learned a lot too, so we greatly appreciate it. Let me take a look here. So Tressa asks, can you speak to the concept of cultural appropriation and how cultural equity best practice can help us navigate this complex topic?
Wow, that's a great question for the first one too, coming out. Okay, so cultural appropriation, I did not list that in the list of definitions for culture, but cultural appropriation is seen as perhaps a certain group of people, and I'll use an example, say Black people and twerking. They've been twerking for years. It was part of their culture. It's part of our ancestry. If you look at the dances from Africa, you'll see the women shaking and moving their butts as twerking. It only became, well, not only became, it became very popular when Miley Cyrus was twerking. Okay, now it's trending and it's fashionable to do so. And now everyone is positive about twerking and trying to do it for themselves. And not just African Americans, it becomes a part of a culture of other races. So whether we think of it as the majority race, bringing it on, and now it becomes a trendy thing to do. How do we navigate that? How do we navigate from having what was once a group's own culture be taken over by another? There are two sides to it. You know, some people say you imitate me, and that should be seen as a compliment, right? Some people say it as, you know, can I have something of our own that we raise our families with, and it becomes a part of who we are, and that's what we're known for. How do we navigate that? It's, for me, I have to tell you, it's been a personal issue where I've had to share with. There are times when, you know what, it was looked at as a bad thing, but some of the things now, because it's trending and because if it were not for the majority race approving or appropriating it, it would not be seen as a positive for a culture. I don't know. I'm going to have to leave that with an I don't know how to navigate that when it becomes so personal to you. To speak for the race or for a culture to say, it's a good thing or this is what I would do. What I've shared with my children, and this is getting really personal, what I've shared with my children is that appreciate who you are. When someone takes over what you believe was yours and what we've taught you is our value, share with them the history of it, where it came from, so that they'll know this is not a new thing. You just didn't invent this. This has been here all along. So what I do, rule of thumb, is to make sure that hopefully the next generation will learn its history.
That's awesome. So someone else is asking, what are some examples you've seen where small organizations have successfully adopted good cultural equity practices?
Okay. So yes, well, when I started off sharing with you a little bit about who I am, I listed all of those companies that I worked with for a good reason. I am flexible, no, but also because whenever I was with a company, I'd make sure I learned something from that particular organization. And what I learned from one of the organizations is what we called an affinity group. It was a business resource group, employee resource group. Some terms are used in large and small organizations. But they used it because they saw that the product that they were putting out was missing niches, and it was missing those niches with discernible income. And what we know by research is that African Americans and Hispanics have large disposable income that they will spend on greeting cards, right? If we give them greeting cards that fit their niche, fit their sending and receiving opportunities. And so with the business resource group that was developed at that particular company, the largest greeting card company in the world, that particular company, those business resource groups started doing focus groups. They started talking amongst themselves, and they knew what the business and the vision of the business was and was able to say, well, here's what we like. Because of my culture, and we have an affinity group for Hispanics, I can share with you what our Hispanic culture is about, and here's what we'd like to see in a greeting card. The same with African Americans. They started an ERG, an employee resource group, and said, well, we know what we will buy. We know what we spend our disposable income on, and we want greeting cards that represent us in this fashion. And they were able to leverage that with business leaders and therefore showing a profit for this large greeting card company. So that's one example of how these particular examples of how we navigate cultural equity and place some suggestions into the workforce. Thank you for the question.
Someone else asks, well, they're saying that they believe that there's an important category missing on the gender definitions slide of intersex. And so they're kind of wanting to know more about that category, if you know much about it, or.
That is something I would have to look up. I'm sorry, I don't know a particular definition to give you today.
Great, no worries. All righty, let's see what else we have here. Aaron says thank you.
Thank you, Aaron.
Okay, so Jeff Reese, my apologies, I'm umming as I search through these questions. Thank you everybody for submitting your questions. But Jeff asks, by definition, is bias always bad?
No, by definition, bias is not always bad. Thanks for the question, Jeffrey. Jeff, I'm not sure. Is it Jeff? Okay. So bias can be good, especially when we teach early on in life safety biases. For instance, bias for children going off to school. For raising children and they're going to run off to the bus, you want them to know who's a stranger, right? And not everyone who looks like you is friendly. So you have to come up with some type of description to say, if someone is doing this and they're sneering at you or they're trying to grab you or this is, there's someone you don't recognize from your community, no, have a bias against strangers who are intending to hurt you. Have a bias against things that could cause you to or should cause you to flee. Have a bias against things that are hot. Don't touch it. You'll burn yourself. So there are biases that are for safety that we certainly believe are good biases to have.
Cool. So Dan would like to ask, looking at genres of folk music like the blues that drew organically from multiple cultures, including marginalized cultures, but developed into the mainstream, what is our responsibility to raise cultural awareness of our influences? How do we do this in our conferences?
Okay. Thank you for that question. We do that like what I was sharing earlier, I think with the first question about cultural appropriation. Give recognition where it's due. If you know the history of the blues, and so now you're creating music from the blues, and someone from that genre truly piqued your interest, that you received a lot of inspiration from, give them a shout out for sure. That helps. You never know who's in the audience. Someone else, especially other generations, can look back to say, let me look up who that particular name is. For me, it piques interest, not only in the genre, but also I think it draws respect to the person who's recognizing others. I think you own up to what's not originally yours and say, I give credit to, or this is my base from which I inherit my ideas, my muse.
Okay, great. Kind of along that same vein, do you have any thoughts or practices for creating safe spaces at conferences, festivals, other folk music events? Is there something that the organization could be doing? Is there certain training for volunteers or staff? Is that even a thing, like safe spaces? Is that something?
Thanks for the question. At the conferences that I've attended recently, I've not noticed safe spaces. What I have noticed are people wearing lapel pins. Those lapel pins identifying their values and who they support. So whether it's, for me, the pride pin, for others, it could be an association that they may have, particularly with a Chamber of Commerce. So for me, it could also be the the Heartland Chamber of Commerce pin that I wear, and it recognizes locally here. It's not a universal, but locally here, by the design of the pin, you may notice that it's for those who are from the African American race. So it could be how you also put your name on the badge that you wear and introducing your name. As I mentioned before in the tagline for email, it could be Evelyn Boswell, she, her, hers. And that will identify people, hopefully, that you are a safe place. You are a safe confidant.
Great.
You know what? I'd like to ask the audience if they know of other situations, because I have not personally seen it, but maybe someone who's listening in has.
Yeah, great. If anyone has any suggestions, please feel free to send it to us in a question, but we'll get that it's an answer. Just a few others before we wrap up here today. Are there some common missteps or mistakes that people make that I can avoid while still trying to move forward?
Oh, yes. And you're talking to a person, thanks for the question. You're talking to a person who's put her foot in her mouth multiple times. And do what I do, and please do what I've shared, and that is apologize, sincerely apologize. So some things that you can do is do your research, do your homework, ask questions. I can take you back to, and this is a long time ago, when there was the controversy of whether African Americans wanted to be called Black or African American. And the best thing that could have happened was someone not realizing and asking me, Evelyn, would you rather be considered Black or African American? That gave me an opportunity to speak up for my values, my beliefs, and how I wanted to be identified. And so the same, I hope, is that people would not take offense if I were to ask, how would you like to be identified? Does it take courage? It certainly does. I'm an extrovert by nature. So it's pretty hard for someone who does not have that outgoing personality when they're meeting someone new or talking to a stranger, like that book I shared with you that I wanted to read. So yeah, research, ask people. Don't be afraid. We have to get out of our comfort zones, and that's what creates the cultural competency that we're talking about today. So an easy way is if there is a heritage festival going on in your surrounding community, attend it. There's lots of people around. You're not placed on the spot, and you can meander at your own pace. And then you go up to a booth and maybe you ask a question or you take a pamphlet or whatever it is that they're giving out for free. Take that back home, research it, read upon it, and maybe the next time you venture out, it's now a more intimate setting that you're meeting people and you're getting to ask more questions, find out a little bit more. But again, when we make mistakes, and I say when, because we're not perfect, we're gonna mess up. And when we do, just sincerely apologize, but don't belabor it. Apologize and move on, because what we don't want to do is make the apology about ourselves. The person that you just invalidated is feeling probably awkward. Perhaps that's what I would think. Apologize, make sure they know that you're sincere, and move on. If it's some way that you could pull them, in a private situation, maybe you have a further discussion.
Great. Are there any other resources or any other like maybe books or things you've attended or any other resources that you would recommend to people? Or are you open to people emailing with you questions if we share your email?
I would love that. Yes, my email is posted there on the PowerPoint, that last PowerPoint presentation. If that's still up, Leah, certainly evebos4@gmail.com. Email me. I'd love to connect with you. Any way we certainly can. You can find me on LinkedIn. I'd love to connect with you that way. My phone number is there too. I'm so old-fashioned, I don't have to text people. I'll talk on a cell phone. And as you can see, I love talking. So that's one thing. But some other things that I've done, and for those of you who have children around you, like I said, I have a teenage son. My teenage son was a member of a diversity club in his high school. And so he got to meet lots of people. And he would invite them over to the house. So these youngsters are coming over to my house, and they are from diverse backgrounds. Where we live is one of the most diverse high schools in all of Kansas City. So we're meeting people, first generation, from countries such as Vietnam, Cambodia, Africa as a continent. I'm not sure of which countries in Africa, but we're meeting lots of people. And when he brings them over, great opportunity because I'm welcoming them into the home. We're asking questions. They're asking questions of me because I must meet the parents of the children who are coming to my home. Now we're communicating adults to adults, learning our different cultures. And I can tell you, the best thing is sharing the foods of different cultures for me because I do love to eat different cultures. I find that fascinating to eat the foods from different cultures. And so in sharing that, that's a way to break down some barriers. I find over food, you can talk about mostly anything, right? And not upset or offend anyone. So it's a great opportunity that way to meet people through youngsters.
That's great. That's amazing. Well, I think that's kind of covering all of our questions. Is there any last minute comments you would like to make?
There are. Leah, I just want to thank you. Thank you to Folk Alliance International. I appreciate you being my production specialist here in the studio. I would also like to thank Jennifer Rowe and Angus Fannin and Jared Rivers. They really helped to put this production on today. And without you, it wouldn't have been possible. So thank you to all who listened in, who took the time out of your day to do so. Much appreciation to my president and CEO of Renaissance Management, Jim Eccles, and the entire Renaissance Management training team. Thank you all and have a fantastic day. Email with any further questions you may have.
Awesome. Well, Evelyn, thank you so much for being here today. We really appreciate it. And to all of our attendees that are listening, thank you for joining us for our Folk Ed webinar. We hope you found the ideas that were presented here useful to you, and we hope you take all of the ideas and everything you learned back to your communities. I just want to remind you that Folk Alliance will be hosting a Cultural Equity Summit this January while we are in New Orleans for our conference. It'll be January 23rd, hosted by the Association for Cultural Equity. We also welcome anyone who represents a marginalized community who is interested in being part of our Cultural Equity Task Force to also reach out to us by email. That email address is equity@folk.org. Again, that's EQUITY @folk.org. And if you have any questions about what that task force entails, feel free to reach out to us. Again, Evelyn, thank you for joining us. Everyone that joined us online, thank you so much. We really appreciate it, and have a good rest of your day.